All right, so again,
187?
yes, page 187. We're having some problems, some technical difficulties. The tape will be okay, but it's not showing on the wall right now. And I did what they told me to do when this happens. I unplugged, plugged back in, checked the other plug, plugged back in, checked my connection, did a Windows P, and made sure I was running dual content. Everything looked fine, but it's not coming up. So we are going to go over chapter 7, but the way we're going to do it is you're going to be looking at the copy that's in your book. All right. Then there's one more thing that we're going to do toward the end of class, or toward, after our break, whenever we finish this. I'm going to show you very quickly how to make a copy of a database in PHP and MyAdmin. It's so hard, it probably takes 30 seconds, literally. And when you do the next worksheet, we'll work with the copy. Because that way, if you do updates, deletes, inserts, etc., if you happen to screw up, you're going to screw up on the copy. You're not going to screw up on the original. All right? All right. So, page 187, how to code subqueries. A subquery is literally a query within a query. There are a lot of ways you can do this. I believe I mentioned this to you before, but on the off chance I did not, this is the hardest chapter that we cover. Now, if you look in here, they said there's an introduction to subqueries, which just takes a minute, how to code queries in the where clause, which is about 10 pages, how to code queries in the having, the select, and the from clause, which is 2 or 3 more pages. My goal in here is not to screw with you guys and to say, hey, I'm going to give you such hard queries, you'll never be able to figure them out. No, you'll have a subquery or two, probably 2 or 3, and we'll do at least one of them next week as a class. Does that make sense? All right. So if it's like, if it seems so daunting, or it's like, I don't know how to do this, just wait till next week. All right. I'm working right now. I just have the first 2 pages done of your next assignment, but I'm hoping to get them done by the end of the day, and then I'm going to give you all a hard copy and an electronic copy of that. So if you are close to finishing that first worksheet, which is due Friday, all right, and as you can guess, I won't be looking at it this weekend, but I'll be looking at it at the beginning of next week. So get it to me, if possible, by Friday, all right? But let's suppose that Matthew says, yeah, I've already got it done. Great. Then what I'll do tomorrow again is to give you a hard copy and an electronic copy of the next worksheet. That one will be due a week from Monday, which I believe is like the 9th of April. All right? Next week, the plan is, as long as I'm here, and I should be, next week, Monday, we're going to go over Chapter 10. Tuesday, we're going to go over Chapter 11. Wednesday, we're going to go over Chapter 12. That's it for this book. We're not doing anything additional. All right? Thursday and Friday will be labs the entire period. And you will have one last assignment where I'm going to ask you to attempt to create a database from scratch. All right? And we'll get to all that stuff next week, so don't worry about it right now. All right. Again, a subquery is a query within a query. Please turn to page 189 of the book. Page 189. On the top of page 189, what you should see there is it says 4 ways to introduce a subquery in a select statement. Everybody see what I'm talking about? They are using it in a where clause, using it in a having clause, using it in a from clause, using it in a select clause. We're only going to concentrate, so any homework I give you on this will be only from the first, number 1, from the where clause. Why? Because it's the easiest. All right? And again, I just want you to be exposed to this, but there's so much in this chapter. It may not seem like it because it's not a real long chapter, but there's so much in this. So let's look at this first example that you see near the top of page 189. All right, do you notice how some of that query is in yellow? That's the subquery. It's a query inside of a query. All right, and you look at that and you're like, that's just weird. Why would you ever do that? There is no, would you agree with this, that in the C# class, or maybe even last semester in the JavaScript class, you learn how to create a loop within a loop? Would you agree with that? You know, you could have a for loop within a for loop, etc. Yes? No? Yes? Okay. That's what this is doing. There is no limit. You can have a query within a query within a query within a query within a query. You could nest this as many times as you want to. But what I want you to understand about this is, if you look at the query on your screen, what the system does first is it runs the query in yellow. All right? So it runs that query in yellow, where it gets the average invoice total. The amount that it returns, as you can see right there, is $1,879.74 plus cents. Does that make sense? Then it uses that output as the input to the other query. So it does a select invoice number, invoice date, invoice total from invoices where invoice total greater than 1879.74. Does that make sense? Because that's half the battle right there, is to understand what the hell is happening here. All right? And again, people sometimes, because I've given this lecture before, where people come back to me and they go, okay, I get it. Why don't you just write 2 queries? And you could. You could write the inside query first, all right? And then you could use the output of that and then write the second query, and instead of putting a select in there, just put in that number. You could do that. But oftentimes, as a database person, people want stuff immediately. They're going to run these queries all the time. They don't want to run a succession of queries. They want one big query that's going to give them all the information they want, if possible. That's the reason for doing this. All right? So you can see when you look at the results set and you look at the invoice totals that are there, hopefully you notice every one of those invoice totals, every one is greater than 1,879.74 plus. Does that all make sense? All right. And if we look on the bottom, in the description part on the bottom of this page, a subquery is a select statement that's coded inside of another SQL statement. You must enclose the subquery within parentheses. That thing in yellow, notice how the whole thing's in parens? You must do that. That's the syntax of a MySQL subquery. A query within a query. It must be, all right, inside of parentheses. All right. A subquery can return a single value, a list of values, or a table of values, depending on how it's written. All right. Next, a subquery can be coded or introduced anywhere that you use a single value or a list of values or a table. The syntax for a subquery is the same as the syntax for a regular select statement. But it says a subquery can't include an order by clause. Please look at the yellow again. All right, please look at the query in the yellow at the top of the page. Notice there's an order by. Everybody see that at the bottom? That order by cannot be inside of the subquery. So the subquery itself, what you see in yellow in the parens, cannot have an order by in it. It just breaks the rules of the language. So again, what we're saying is we want to figure out how many people have an invoice total that's greater than the average. And rather than writing it as 2 queries, we're writing it as a single query. And that single query has a query that we're using. The output from that query, the inner query, is used as the input to the outer query. All right? That's what subqueries are all about. All right. When to use subqueries. 190. Please turn to 191. This is where it gets a little bit confusing. Please go to page 191 at the top of the page. Virtually any time you write a subquery, you can write the same thing as a join. Did you hear what I said? There will be at least one question, and maybe 2, and if there maybe 3, but if there's 3, we'll do at least 1 as a class where I'm going to say to you, write this subquery. Then rewrite that as a join. So virtually any time you use a subquery, You can also write it as a join. Okay, so why would you want to use a subquery rather than a join? Usually a subquery will give you your results faster. Not always. Why would you want to use a join instead of a subquery? Because most people get confused as hell when they start looking at subqueries. All right? So when you look right there, the thing in yellow that you see near the top of page 191, what is that query doing? It's giving the vendor ID that has a state that's equal to California. Does that make sense? All right. And then it's using that output. Let's just say it's got 6 vendors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So then if those are the ones, then it's going to give us the invoice number, the invoice date, and the invoice total, where that vendor ID is either a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or a 5 or a 6. Does that make sense? All right. You could run the same query, but I shouldn't say the same query. You could get the same results by running the query at the top of the page, by doing it as a join. There are people that I have known that have worked with databases, all right, that love subqueries. They just get them, and they like to use them whenever they can. There's other people I know, more like me, I don't like them. And I try to do a join whenever I can. All right? Everybody's different. Okay? My wife hates driving on expressways. She hates, since she's been down here and back and down here and back, she hates I-70. She just hates. I love it. I hate it when it's busy, but I love driving on it. All right? So everybody's different. All right, so when we look on the bottom of that page, there they give you advantages of joins. So the first 2 bullets for joins. The select clause of a join can include columns from multiple tables. All right, that's an advantage. Another advantage of a join can be more intuitive. Sometimes people can look at a join, so when you look at those 2 queries at the top of page 191, the first one just makes more sense. It's easier internally to comprehend what's going on. Advantages of subqueries. You can use a subquery to pass in an aggregate value. You now know what aggregates are. Sum, average, min, max, count. You know those because we went over those yesterday or the day before, whatever it was. A subquery tends to be more intuitive when it uses an ad hoc relationship between the 2 tables. So when it's a little bit harder to figure out what's happening, it may be easier to use a subquery. Finally, long, complex queries can sometimes be easier to code using subqueries. You may or may not believe that, but I'm going to show you an example at the end of this chapter where you're going to look at it and go, what the hell? I wouldn't want to do a join or a subquery using this, because they're both ugly as hell. All right? All right. So how to code subqueries in the where clause. Let's move up, if you would please, to page 193. All right? The syntax of a where clause that uses an in phrase. Again, it's not in yellow now, but the key to understanding subqueries is to realize you've got to do the most inner one first. So you're going to run a query that selects the distinct vendor IDs from invoices. So let's suppose we've got 50 vendors, and they're 1 through 50. Okay? So we select the distinct vendor ID from vendors, so we get 1 through 50. So then we select the vendor ID, the vendor name, the vendor state from vendors where the ID is not in this. What that is saying in English is, do we have any vendors who don't have any invoices? So in other words, either they're brand new vendors and they haven't done any business with us, or they're existing vendors and they haven't done business with us in a long time or maybe ever. Does that make sense? All right. So you'll notice the result of the subquery they show you there gives you back 34 rows. All right. And then the result set of the main query gives you back 88 rows. All right. Why? Because some of these people have more than one, again, the input, the output from the inner query is used as the input to the outer query. All right. Now, please look on the middle of page 193. Here is the same resultant query, but done with a join. Virtually 100% of the time, whatever you do using a subquery, you can do with a join. Most of the time, anything you do with a join, you can also do with a subquery. So most of the time, at least, they're pretty interchangeable. That's what the author is saying here. But the point is, we're using the word in here. Why do we use in? You've used in on your first example, right? We've used in before because that's a little bit easier than, so if I say this, if I say select employee ID from employees where employee ID in, and let's just say 1000, 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, and 1005. All right? So if we write that query that you see on the board right now, select employee ID from employees where employee ID in, and then in a parenthesized list, 1000, 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. That's a much easier way, I think, than writing select employee ID from employees where employee ID equals 1000 or employee ID equals 1001 or employee ID equals 1002 or employee ID equals 1003 or employee ID equals 1004 or employee ID equals 1005. I think it's much easier and it involves much less typing, so that the chance of you making an error is minimized. All right? Now notice on the description on the bottom of page 193, the author says, when you use the in operator, the subquery must return a single column. So there's only one thing that can be returned. All right? A query that uses not in can be done using an outer join. Do we care? No. Now let's turn up to page 195, please. Page 195. You may or may not agree, but when you look at this, it's starting to get a little ugly. So let's look at the query that's on page 195. We want the invoice number, the invoice date, and then the balance due, which is basically whatever you owed minus whatever you paid minus whatever you've got credited. We want those three fields, invoice number, invoice date, and this calculated balance due. We want to grab that from the invoice table. All right? But we want to do that where that balance due is greater than 0, all right, and it's less than whatever the average balance due is. All right? So what do? If you look after that and statement there, you see in the parentheses it says select average. That's figuring out the average amount due. All right, so that's returning $2,910.95 after we round it. All right, so that $2,910.95, it gets stuffed into what is currently within those parentheses in the inner select statement. All right, and so what gets returned? Well, if you look at the ones that are shown there a little bit further down, you'll notice that each one of those that's in there, the balance due is $579.42, $503.20, $224, $90.36, $85.31, $67.92, etc. But each one of those is less than the average of $29.10 75. All right? So the author says there, you can use a comparison operator in a where. What are the comparison operators? Less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and not equal to. There are 6 comparison operators. All right? All right, that said, turn up please again to page 197. If you look on page 197, you'll notice that in the query that's shown there, there is the word all. Everybody see that? There is the word all. All right? And if we look at the query there, it shows you how it works above, but it's a little bit confusing. So let's look at the actual query that's shown there. Get all invoices larger than the largest invoice for vendor 34. The queries that are in this chapter, when you do take a minute and look over them, they make sense. All right? But that would be like, for example, you know, let's just suppose, I mean, this just popped into my head, so this is probably one of the goofier things you've ever heard me say. All right? But let's suppose that somebody comes to Rankin Technical College, Wentzville, and they decide that they want to do a commercial, okay? But what happens is they decide that they only want to do a commercial that with people who have green eyes, for whatever reason, all right? And let's suppose that we have that information about you in the database. I don't know why we'd have your eye color, but we're just pretending that we do, all right? So we could look through that database and find everybody whose eyes are green. Everybody whose eyes were not green would not be, you know, they would not be looked at to do the commercial. Everybody whose eyes that were green could be used. All right? So that all would basically return all those people. Now we could put more stuff on it. Maybe we wanted everybody with green eyes, but they had to be male. So let's say that some of the people were female. So then they would be out of it. Then we also said that we want everybody there to be greater than 6 feet tall. So that would throw away some more people. And then we said we wanted everybody to be less than 200 pounds. That would throw away some more people. Does what I'm saying make sense? All right. I mean, that would be stupid. I couldn't imagine somebody coming here and doing that anyway, but you never know. All right. I don't know if I told you or not. Probably don't even care. But last Friday when I went to that employer breakfast, when I was gone for that couple hours on Friday, they showed 2 videos. The first one was for the the automotive program, and the second one was for the manufacturing program. They're both very well done. They're very professional looking. One was 4.5 minutes long. The other one was 3.5 minutes long. And one of the people there, Don Pohl, the vice president of Rankin, was showing the videos. But one of the people there was Missy Borkert, and Missy is our Dean of Enrollment Management. She's the one who set up the videos. She didn't make them. She contracted them out, basically. And so I talked to her afterwards. I said, Missy, those are both well done. She said, well, thanks. I said, when do we get one for IT? Of course, she started laughing. But she said that's actually in the budget for next fall. So it's not impossible. They'll probably do it all in St. Louis. But it's not impossible. They might decide to do it here. And maybe you could even be in it. All right? And then after she told me that, I said, I have one more question for you. And she said, what's that? So when are they going to do one just on the Wentzville campus? Everything you see, basically, all right, when you look at these videos that are out there, all of them virtually, all the shots, etc., they show, they're all St. Louis. I said, people in Wentzville don't even know that there's a campus here. You might say, yeah, right. I met a guy down the road in Wentzville. I went in one day to the Jack in the Box, and most of you know where that is. And the manager, he saw my shirt on, and he says, you work for Rankin? I said, yeah. He said, is that a long drive to St. Louis? I said, no, I work at the one in Wentzville. He said, there's a Rankin in Wentzville? And I said, yeah. And he goes, geez, I live, and I told him where it was. He goes, I live 10 minutes from there. I never knew there was a Rankin. Part of the problem. Hard to attract people when they don't know that you're even there. All right. Turning up to page 199. We talked about using all just a minute ago. And when you use all, that test to make sure it's true for all. All right? For instance, if I said, hey, after class today, we're going to have a pizza party for all of you. You'd all be welcome, right? All right? On the other hand, if we turn up to page 198 and we look in there, you'll notice that talks about the word any. And any, no pun intended, but in there, anywhere they use the word any, you can use the word some. Either one works. All right? You use any if one or more is true. So if I said I'm having a party and I invited all 7 or 8 of you and none of you want to come, but Jesse goes, well, I kind of feel sorry for you, I'll come. All right? Then someone or anyone came. Does that make sense? That's the any or some. So it depends on what it is you're looking for. All right? Some and any work the same way. And believe it or not, that's the easy stuff. So please turn up to page 201. Every query we talked about before this is what's known as, every one that we've talked about so far is what's known as an uncorrelated query. Or an uncorrelated subquery. In other words, it's only executed one time. So again, that would be like, again, I'm going through the class here and I'm looking for people with green eyes that are, 6 feet tall or above and weigh less than or equal to 200 pounds. Boom. I grab everybody's at once and do everything. That's an uncorrelated subquery. But if I go and look at you one at a time, so I do Jesse, then I do Tony, then I do Josh, then I do Ryan, then I do Andrew, etc. That's called a correlated subquery. And if you look on page 201, they show a correlated subquery. So rather than just executing the query once, you execute the query once for each row in the main query. So in other words, if your subquery had 500 rows that it returned, it would execute that query 500 times. All right? If it was a correlated subquery. If it was uncorrelated, it would only do it once. All right? So the correlated subquery refers to the value that's provided by a column in the main query. All right? And you're like, okay, whatever. All right? And like I said, believe me, this lecture is as fun to give as it is to hear. All right? So if we look at the example that's on page 201, get each invoice amount that's higher than the vendor's average invoice amount. So in other words, for each vendor has an average amount that for an invoice. Does that make sense? If I have 10 vendors, that's 10 averages. All right? That previous query that we ran would only get 1 back. But now we want to run this basically once for each vendor. So what we're going to get back is if we've got 36 vendors, we're going to get 36 answers back. Does that make sense? All right? These are harder to write. Now you might look at that and go, that's not any harder. No, it still works the same way in that you do the inner query first, but you do the inner query for every single one of the vendors instead of just doing it once. All the ones we looked at before, we were just returning basically, we were, boom, running, it's one and done. This example they're showing here is 36 times and done. That's the difference. All right. Let's jump to page 203. You'll notice on page 203, they talk about using the word exists. Exists returns true if the subquery gives you one or more records, and exists returns false if the subquery produces no results. So imagine if you look at that query that they have in there. If we had no vendors, maybe we're a brand new company, we don't have any vendors yet, it returns nothing. So exists, all right, exists, basically in that case returns nothing. You can use exists, all right, to test that one or more rows are returned, or you can use not exists like they do here to test if nothing was returned. And again, if that confuses you, let's look at it this way. Let's suppose all of you and me, we all work for the Acme Insurance Company. We're all full-time employees there. All right? And let's say on average, we all make about 50 grand a year. Are you with me? All right. So if I said in there exists, maybe I wanted to check all people who were making $1 million or more. And there were none of us making $1 million or more. Then exists would return false. Does that make sense? All right, so you can run exists to check if one or more rows are returned, or you could check not exist to make sure nothing is returned. So exists, if we check for people making $1 million or more, exists would return false, not exists would return true. All right, and that's exactly what they're saying in there. Again, maybe I'm making this harder than it has to be. I don't know. That said, turn up to page 205, please. You can also do these things if you have to, need to, etc. All right? And you can use these. It says how to code subqueries in the select clause. What does that mean? Look at the query at the top of page 205. Notice that it is not in a where clause like every other one we looked at was. It's inside, we have a select inside of the select. So that inner select that's in the parentheses, that's going to return a field for us. And that's what they're saying you can do. They show it up on the top of the page 205 as a subquery. They show it on the middle of page 205 as a join. When you do this, when you have a select in there, it has to return just a single value. You can't return a range or a whole bunch of stuff. All right. Again, please turn up to page 207. If we look at that subquery at the top of page 207, you'll notice it says, get the largest invoice total for the top vendor in each state. That might actually be something people would want to use. All right, imagine that I'm a marketing person and I want to market to our biggest customers. Who's our biggest customer? All right, they're the ones with the largest invoices, right? They've spent the most. All right, and if I want to do that 50 times, once for each state, I could run a query like this. So when you've got a subquery that's coded inside of a from clause, it's typically referred to as an inline view. Don't worry about that. It's just a name for it, that's all. If you do this, and if you use a subquery for the from clause, you must use one of the aliases with it. All right? All right, just a couple more pages, and then thankfully we're done. If you turn up to page 209, please. I don't know if you agree, but on page 209, there's a query that takes up half the page. Everybody see that? That's a pretty honking big query. But you'll notice that we've got what? An outer query with a select. Then inside we've got a join, all right, that's got a select. That looks to me like the innermost query, and that join's got a query inside of it. So we do the innermost query first, and we work our way out. The output from the innermost query becomes the input to the next query. The output from that query becomes the input to the next query. And there again is no limit to the number of times we can nest if we want to or need to do this. So the query that you see on the screen retrieves the vendor from each state that has the largest invoice total. If you notice in there, they've used comments. All right, they've used comments to try to make it easier. Plus, they've named the stuff. Notice that in the first inner select it says T1, the second one says T2, the third one says T3. That's naming each one of those subqueries. And finally, if you turn up to page 211, I believe this is the last page that we cover in this class, in this chapter. You turn up to page 211. The author gives you a procedure for building complex queries. Step 1, the author says, state the problem you're trying to solve in English. We're getting into right now where these would be complex queries. The problem is you might understand your database really, really well. You might be able to write any query there is. The problem with that is many times the person or persons asking for the query, do you ever hear the old saying, they don't know their ass from a hole in the ground? That's their problem. They ask you for information and you can provide them that, but that's probably not really what they want. So you've got to really talk with the person or persons you are working with to make sure that what you're going to give them is actually what they want. So let's assume you've done that. That's step 1. Step 2 says use pseudocode to outline the query. If you look at the pseudocode that's shown there, about a third of the way down on page 211, it's a combination of an actual select and just writing English. But you can again go back to the person you're doing the query for and say, this is again what I think you're asking for. Am I right? Then in step 3, you can code all the subqueries and run those individual subqueries by themselves to make sure they're giving you the right information that you're looking for. Then finally in step 4, you code and you test the final subquery. And that's what they show you throughout here on the page. So again, the amount of work that I'm going to have you do on this will be minimal. That's a promise. All right? But there'll be something. I don't know yet what it is. I'm still writing this, and I will write it soon, or finish writing it soon. That ends us going through chapters from the beginning of this week, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. On Monday, we did 5 and 6. 5 was the end of section 1. Then we did 6. Yesterday, we did 7 and 8. Today, we're doing 9. So we are now done with the first 2 sections of this book. All right? Next week, ideally at least on Monday, we're going to start section 3 of this book. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but if you do want to, go ahead and turn up, please, to page 275. On page 275, they explain that section 3 of this book consists of 3 chapters. Chapter 10, where you learn how to design a database. Chapter 11, where you learn how to use the DDL, data definition language statements, to create databases, tables, and indexes. Chapter 12, we learn how to create and maintain what are called views. And all a view is it's a query that you give a name to and save. That's what we will do next week. So my hope is, again, by the end of the period today, I will have your second worksheet for you. All right? If you have not done so, we're almost done. If you have not done so, please get into XAMPP right now. Start up XAMPP. We're going to use PHP-MyAdmin again. So again, the second admin button down, the one that's in the same row as MySQL, make sure you start up Apache and start up MySQL like we've been doing. So click both those buttons. And then the second button, the second admin button that you see there, that's in the same row as the MySQL, click that. That will again start up for us PHP-MyAdmin. I'm looking, and the few machines I can see here, everybody's done that. Just so you know, you may or may not care, but I want you to at least hear the terminology. All right. When we first got into XAMPP and you saw that thing that came up where you had to push the button to start Apache and you had to push the button to start MySQL, etc., that's called the C panel. C for control. It's called the C panel. It looks different depending on the software that you're using. All right. Now, we click that admin button. We're all in the PHP MyAdmin, correct? That's where everybody is right now. All right. Now, I want you to choose your sales order example database on the left. So take your mouse, put it over on the databases that should be showing on the left. Take your mouse and click on the one that says sales order example. If it worked, now what you're going to see in the middle of your screen is all of those tables. Categories, customers, employees, orders, order detail, products, product vendors, and vendors. Are we still all together? Anybody have any problems doing this? All right, we're half done already. All right, now look on the top of your screen. You see a bunch of tabs there that say structure, SQL, search, query. You see all those? Right now the structure tab is the one up. Yesterday we did the SQL tab, and that's where we keyed in our queries. What I want you to do today is click the tab that says operations. It's got a wrench by it. It's the second and last thing. Click that rather. If it comes up and you get a screen where in the middle it says database comment, rename database to, etc. Is that where everybody is? So let's pretend for a second. Jesse created his database, and I told everybody to create a database called sales order example. You with me? I told everybody to do that. And Jesse kind of fat-fingered when he did this, and he spelled example. All right, his says example, X-ample. He forgot the X, the letter X in there. He could go down where it says rename database to and rename it. Does that make sense? We don't want to do that. We want to go down. You're going to have to arrow down to almost the very bottom on the left-hand side where it says copy database to. Does everybody see that? Anybody who doesn't see that, take your mouse and put it inside of the white box underneath where it says copy database to. All right? Right now we have this database. I don't want you to type this. Right now we have this database. Sales, orders, example. We're going to make a copy of it, but to make it easy, we're just going to call our copy, and you can type in this. Sales, orders. Don't type in sales orders examples. You can't make a copy that's got the same name as the original. All right? So just type in sales orders. All right, so type it into that box. It really probably isn't even case dependent, but I'm going to make the S in sales and the O in orders both capitalized. All right? After you've done that, look at the buttons that are below that. If we only wanted the schema, so if we only wanted the tables without the data, we'd click the button that says structure only. We don't want that. At least on mine and probably on yours, the button that says structure and data is probably highlighted. If that middle button out of those three there is not highlighted, then click it. Everybody's done that, correct? We all have chosen structure and data. All right? Then looking on mine, yours again should be the same way. What I've got checked is create database before copying, add auto increment value, and add constraints, and adjust privileges. I've got those 4 things checked. Is that what you all have checked? We're going to leave them just the way they are. Just click the button that says go. It says copying database. Literally, it'll take just a few seconds. Then you should get a yellow box that's got a green box inside of it that says database sales orders examples was copied to database sales orders or something like that. And if you look along the side on your left-hand side, right up above sales orders example, you should now have sales orders. Am I correct? Click the one that just says sales orders. That's your database copy. That's the one I want you to work with for your second worksheet. That way we can do all sorts of stuff. Okay, we can do anything we want. All right? So let's suppose you're working on this. All right, you're working on this. So Tony's working on his, and for some reason he's like, you know what, I don't know how, but I really screwed up this database. I just did. I've got my original, I get that. So again, with the sales orders database up again, click your operations button one more time. Do you notice down towards the right middle or so, it says remove database? Can you see that? And underneath it, there should be a red. In red, it says drop the database, drop. If you decide you wouldn't want that database or you hose that one up, that's how you drop it. All right? So you should now know how to copy a database, all right, and if necessary, how to drop a database. Anybody have any problems with any of that? All right, the rest of the period then is yours. I'm going to be here, but the rest of the period is yours. All right?